Yes, good morning, people, lovely people. I'm here to read about S. Wood Barrett Browning. This is called How to Be Dutiful. Male poets are preferable, straining less and telling more. Lady Valdemar. When Elizabeth shuts down the door to her little slip of sitting room, she sits out much of the imperfect world. Though she loves and depends upon in and out, of course, Crow, Flush, and Papa, her brothers and sisters, but the battle of wills over who can stay with her is finished. No more wheedling and bribing, and no more ponies and riding habits. Above all, nobody to be responsible for, and she feels she is responsible for Bro's presence and death in Torquay. And 36, Elizabeth has absolutely no longing for a household of her own, like the one Mary Russell Mitford struggles to maintain. She unexpectedly recovered from the near fatal illness which followed those catastrophic losses at Torquay. She had left her grateful for much less than her child self would have settled for. Actually, domestic comfort and care replaces dreams of bulk and adventure. Settled family life trees her to right, and so she has every reason to be complicit in Papa's increasingly apparent desire to keep his children close. His surviving brothers are too busy working, Charles away in Jamaica, George is a barrister, traveling in Henry's case, or studying. Sete has become a barrister, OK an architect. The sisters have become to a home to run. Only Elizabeth, set aside by illness, is uniquely free to do as she wishes. It turns out that the duties belong to my femininity, not even include sewing. You can scarcely imagine my awkwardness when I pretend to work, such pricking in fingers and knotting in thread and sewing backwards in certain evolutions instead of forwards. The busy household beyond the door blurs to the consoling thrum since she's known since childhood. Domestic love only seemed to buzzle gently around like bees around the grass, as she later puts it. Besides the thorough and imagined worlds of poetry, Elizabeth not only escapes but feels she transcends the slight dullness of the day. It's a small wonder she recent work has tended to revisit that sacred long with the devotional ecstasy which the Anthemium noted of the seraphim. The way this poetry turns repeatedly from an often burdensome embodiment self to an implicit spiritual feeling can seem awkward and dated for the 21st century reader. For the woman who's doing it, it is an act of will, a liftoff from life. At the same time, she can't deny the highly material facts of living on Wimpole Street in the heart of one of London's smartest residential districts. The capital surrounds her with its rattle and hum. Writing friends surrounds her too. Suddenly easily accessible, she no longer needs to cook up projects like the ill fated Psyche Apocalypte in order to keep in touch. They can visit. If ill health prevents her from visiting in return, well, that's a useful fig leaf for the twin obstacle of Papa's protectiveness and her own shyness. The writing world seems to scent out this new proximity, and as being simply being in London makes her altogether more real. Predictably, Mary Russell Mitford is among the first to visit. Just 6 weeks after Elizabeth returned, stayed at Wimpole Street for 2 nights at the end of October 41. The two enjoy a good catch up through disappointingly, without Flush Sr., who wasn't allowed on the train. How uncivilized is the world is still. Miss Mitford's friendship and support, including annual commissions for Findens Tableau, has also exclusively sustained Elizabeth's writings through her Tokay exile. By now that the writing continues to develop, Elizabeth begins to spread her wings at almost imperceptible degrees beyond the loving mentorship. By autumn 41, the success of the Seraphim is established, and 3 years on from its appearance, Elizabeth is beginning to receive substantial commissions. The Anthemium has published a couple of her poems, and now his energetic and literary minded editor, Charles Wentworth Dilke, agrees to pitch for her on Greek Christian poems, only be begging me to keep away from theology and suggesting a subsequent revival of English poetical literature from Chaucer down to our times. As she tells Mr. Boyd, who remains willy nilly her go to things classical. The result long essay is published in 3 parts in February and March 42, and it is following between June and August of the Part 5 survey of English verse, which Elizabeth titles the Book of Poets. The book is, she realizes, a crack of canon forming and an influential publication too, so she takes it seriously. The ideal analogy she pictures excludes more drama, but includes more religious poetry than its predecessors. She managed to slip into a vignette of Robert, today usually held by William Langland, medieval author of Piers Plowman, as a Malvern poet, which allows her to claim her own home ground at Hope End, at the birthplace of English poetry. Should I read that again? She manages to slip in a vignette of Robert, today usually held by William Langland, medieval author of Piers Plowman, as a Malvern poet, which allows her to claim her own home of Hope End at the birthplace of English poetry. As is well the thinkers of England to remember reverently while taking out of her poetry and stand among the gores, that it is made boast now of more honored localities, of Shakespeare's rocky Avon, of Spenser's soft streaming Thames, and Wordsworth's Rydal Mere. Still our first holy poet ground is there. And the glimpse of personal foundation myth, Elizabeth goes on to outline a pantheon built by the tripod of Geoffrey Chaucer, Dilke's Parameter, William Shakespeare, of course, and the currently unfashionable William Wordsworth. She mounts a spirit ad hominem defense of the 72-year-old, not yet poet laureate, whose masterpiece, The Prelude, will remain unknown until it's posthumely published 8 years from now. Along the way, she names Alfred Tennyson and Robert Browning as coming men, arguing that too many poets do not live by the truth, but hold back their full length from art because they do not reverence in it, and all booksellers cry aloud that poetry will not sell, and certain critics utter melancholy frenzies that poetry is worn out forever. In the meantime, the Tennysons and the Brownings and other high-gifted spirits will work, wait on. In contrast, her vision of a heroic life and poetic duty, which she alludes with the figure of Wordsworth, has an almost revivalist fervor. The long life's work, it's for its sake, and work for observation, of meditation, of reading past models in nature, of reading past nature into God, and early life's loss for its sake, the loss of popular cheer, and of critical assent, and the money in the purse. Critical intelligence, however idealistic, needs to keep him engaging. Elizabeth's next piece for the Athenaeum is the end of August, is a review of Wordsworth poems, chiefly of early and late years. The book's publisher of Edward Moxon, we need to remember that name. I have Edward Moxon's book right behind me here, 1839 version. A driven, ambitious editor who also recently published Mary Shelley's first posthumous poems of Percy Blythe Shelley, the swiftly withdrawn 1839 edition, Alfred Tennyson's Reputation, Making Poems of 1842, and Robert Browning's Sordello, 1840, as well as a series of leading dramatists. He is, in short, the publisher of choice, and by the end of the year, Elizabeth is proposing a volume of her own poems to him. That's Edward Moxon. Or rather, she sends her brother George to intercede on her behalf. The meeting doesn't go well. No, Moxon won't have my poems, Elizabeth tells Miss Mitford. Yeah, he got in prison for printing Shelley's and Byron's poems. So let us continue. Moxon won't have my poems, Elizabeth tells Miss Mitford. This is a rude awakening. She's been planning to collect her fugitive poetry to make a volume that might ensure a positive reception for the long poem she wants to work on next. But the business-like editor did protest like a bookseller his respect for Miss Barrett's genius, the only drawback being that he preferred having nothing to do with her. He said that he happened to be personally connected with several poets and from mere personal motives have been drawn in to publish their poems as they did not sell, that Mr. Tennyson sold the best. Indeed, he might almost say that his last volume has succeeded what Wordsworth was only beginning to sell. When Moxon changes his mind the following spring, Elizabeth will be delighted, though it's really only editorial common sense. Her poetry is appearing regularly in all right places, but his acceptance will arrive via John Kenyon, who has expressed surprise at the initial brush-off suggesting that her old friend may have had once again to be her advocate. It also suggests that, however modern his literary taste, Moxon is capable of old-fashioned gender prejudice. After all, he's not just illness that stops Elizabeth going out and about in literary launches, opening nights and dinners, even schmoozing in short, like the other leading poets of what's becoming her writing generation, Tennyson and Browning among them. It's also that she's a woman. She has to make a relationship on the page. In October 1842, the painter Benjamin Robert Hayden, who was also arrested, I believe, a new friend, Miss Mitford, had introduced by letter, lends Elizabeth a just colored completed portrait of Wordsworth at Helvellyn, and just over 3 foot by 4 feet, a striking canvas is nearly life-size. It portrays the old man with arms crossed, deep in thought, a pose both heroic and reflective, though apparently the old man kept nodding off during the actual sitting. Small wonder this is the painter's homage to Wordsworth's 1840 sonnet, only on a portrait of the Duke of Wellington on the field of Waterloo by Hayden, which itself represents to Hayden's 39 canvas, Wellington musing on the field of Waterloo, in which the Duke takes up a not dissimilar stance, has back to us but craggy profile visible, gazing only over a dramatically lit landscape. Elizabeth having herself framed Wordsworth as a poet hero in her Anthemium essay, sends Hayden a sonnet of her own on a portrait of Wordsworth by B.R. Hayden on October 17th. It appears in the Anthemium less than a fortnight later. Elizabeth tells the artist, "You have brought me Wordsworth and Helvellyn and into this dark and solitary room," but she refuses to meet him, remaining to his frustration, "My dear invisible friend, always to correspond and never to descend into the vulgarity of speaking." She's still exasperatingly susceptible to a harming shyness, and everything different on paper, a world she can't control. Perhaps that one reason that she's so interested in America, still a place almost entirely of the imagination of most Britons. Another reason will be that the Barretts are among the few for whom family life goes on across the Atlantic. When the New York Daily Tribune and the New York Weekly Tribune reprint her Hayden sonnet, it just starts her reputation there. She begins to appear repeatedly in the Boston Melancholy, in the United States Magazine, and the Democratic Review. Mid-century North America, she has an exasperated post-colonial respect for British writers, but Elizabeth is also repeatedly published by Graham's Magazine, which is edited by Cornelius Matthews, a young New York-based activist at the Homegrown Literature. In 1845, Matthews will explicitly align himself with anti-aristocratic Young America politics, named in part after the Young Italy movement, in which Elizabeth will become herself a passionate advocate, even a kind of celebrity supporter. Young America, based largely on the cities of the North, will be pro-immigration and in favor of rights for all, free trade, and international republicanism, making it a more radical version of the British Whig thought espoused by the Barretts. But in 42, Matthew is still working with colleagues to create the North American literature, which will enable the careers of George Bancroft, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and others. Elizabeth's poetry is welcomed in these circles despite her nationality, because she shares the political and poetic ideas. The American peers, her writing is fresh and modern, and Elizabeth, ever the idealist, responds to both political appeal and personal friendship. Matthews, 11 years her junior, is perhaps her ideal correspondent, safely on the other side of the Atlantic, and is unlikely to drop in unannounced. She praises his writing vital sinewy vigor in print and tells James Russell Lowe, another member of his circle, "I love the Americans and America for the sake of national brotherhood and of a common literature, and I wonder when for the sake of liberty and noble aspiration, and I am grateful to them, very grateful for their kind of me personally as a poet, for despite her growing international reputation, as 1844 opens, Elizabeth is feeling isolated in the dark and solitary room where her most frequent companion is her maid. She claims a fine madness by turning servants into friends. Traces remain of depressive guilt upon Bro's death, that bitter anguish of bestowing evil, unmitigated evil, where you would only cause good. She is also suffering from chronic pain, has begun corresponding with fellow Northumbrian Harriet Martineau, a distinguished feminist theorist, social theorist who was in the same year publishers or autobiographer collection of essays, Life on the Sick Room, Essays by an Invalid, also housebound and suffering from what's believed to be an incurable uterine tumor. Martineau is one of the few able to understand how Elizabeth feels physically. How entirely I agree with you about severe pain, about its lowering and perverting influences. Nobody who ever was familiar with very severe pain could say the good of it that one sees said in books, but does it baffle one's will? Your picture of yourself looks cheerful and pretty, but I am not one to be deceived by your religious cheerfulness into an oversight of the suffering while lies beneath. The woman who moreover share a free-thinking religious nonconformism, discussive topic absorbing interest of both of them, mesmerism, hypnotherapy, and its possible use for a cure for physical illness. In November, Martineau, apparently miraculously cured for years of suffering, will publish a controversial series of letters in the Enthemeum advocating it for a cure. Though Elizabeth experiences no such radical improvement, she remains longly enthusiastic about this and all supernatural and will support her friend in the face of widespread public skepticism. At times, she will even seem to float into a psychological twilight. In her room, drawing blinds and insomnia blurs the difference between dreaming like in nights and color for imagination. I dare to perceive or imagine the grandeur of spiritual subjects, spiritual and angels, spreading their faint, shadowless glories over a vast surface. She's still taking opium, ostensibly for difficult sleeping. It's like the dose was increased in Torquay, and admits to Martineau that produces fairy visions. Since her return home, there's been a distinctly opiate flavor to her at times, near daily correspondence with Miss Mitford, with her disinhibited self-disclosure and obsessional working over details. Besides, none of her visions are fairy, fretting over John Kenyon, who for weeks exchanges visits with the rest of the family while somehow failing to make it to her own room. Elizabeth's worries about possible scandal in her private life and is yet more concerned about his plan to buy a villa in Torquay, which he depicts as locked in a grotesque dance macabre. It is not such a dancing, fiddling, cart-playing, gossiping place in all the rest of England as Torquay is. There is not so much as a dissipated place in the strongest sense, and it's a ghastly merriment. Almost every family member has a member either threatened with illness or ill. Wherever is merry, and so is in a hospital. They carry away the dead to take in benches of the company. The ghastliness of the collision there between life and death, merriment and wailing, has made me flesh creep sometimes. Woman in the last agony in one house, a corpse laid out in the other, and the whole surviving Torquay dancing intermittently. Since her woman in Wimpole Street, an odd mixture of superstition and religious mysticism, Mr. Hayden's mystical way of talking of the poetry of dark has started to overtake the appeal of transcendence. I have recognized once again the charm of the mystical, which is in fact the voice of our own souls, calling us through the dark of our ignorance, listening to those rustling sounds of what may be varieties beyond the shell of the body. The highly active imagination is badly in need of an outlet. Elizabeth starts to complete a long narrative poem, yet her mind turns first to Napoleon and then to Joan of Arc, and I find myself wistfully towards Joan. Perhaps my original sin of mysticism is struggling towards her vision. She tells Miss Mitford, my belief is that she was true. She goes on, did you ever hear of Stilling, the German book upon the pneumonatology? You and I believe everything, and Heinrich Schilling wants us to believe more than everything. For some weeks, she fixates on this work, arguing for the existence of the spirit world. John Heinrich Jung, Schilling's theory of pneumatology, loaning her own first copy to Miss Mitford and then to Mrs. Mitford's friend, Miss Niven. Not surprisingly, the poems she's currently writing increasingly explore this new territory in the rhapsody of life's progress. We are born into life. It is sweet. It is strange. we still lie on the knee of the mild mystery. Despite all this, Elizabeth's actual poem voice is becoming steadily clearer and fresher. Gone are the considered pseudo-Greek metrics, replacing in newly like Wine in Cyprus and The Lady of the Early Rose is newly fashionable ballad and song forms particular from popular culture. More modern still is her use of her female narrators, of course, women as protagonists in verse, from Penelope in Homer's Odyssey to Geoffrey Chaucer's 14th century The Wife of Bath, or 2 centuries later Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, are nothing new. But the female voice lyric is a radical departure. Lyric poetry persona is necessarily both personal and universal. When I read a poem, I step into the poem's eye, creating an illusion of plunging into intimacy with the female psyche. Elizabeth's new narrative poems are speaking by women's characters, like the greater of the great 16th century Portuguese poet Luís de Camões. Catarina de Camões is the epitome of Bertha in the Lane, whose stories highlight the female identity of the voice and the poet's voice, too. After all, they aren't being ventriloquized by male poets, and of course, sometimes are simply rights in a female first person without dressing up in character. In the 21st century, none of this is new. When seeing the female lyric, I'd be prayerful with Emily Dickinson, self-flagellating with Sylvia Plath, witness to history with Anna Akhmatova, and radical writers changing their own zeitgeist, not ours, or rather they already changed ours back when they changed their own. In the 1840s, when none of these poets had yet started work, Elizabeth's voice was as radical and exciting, and without the changes she effecting, none of their poetry might have been written. Led by description and story, the newly narrative verse that she and fellow poets like Tennyson and Browning are writing is freshly founded in the lived world of interpersonal experience. These innovative Victorian fables in verse aren't only more emotionally and intellectually accessible than romantic poetry, they're also a great deal more respectable. Lord Byron's narrative epic, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and Don Juan turned him into an international literary celebrity in the early decades of the century, but neither is exactly suitable manner for the new domestic habits that are reading aloud when family entertainment becomes family entertainment. Elizabeth's mid-century generation are making poetry accessible to a society being rapidly reshaped by the family values the new queen has brought to public life since her accession in 1837. And so the Moxon publishes, remember we talked about Edward Moxon? So as Edward Moxon publishes Elizabeth's poems in 1844, and she returns to planning the verse novel and will become Aurora Leigh, she specifically envisages a cleanup of Don Juan to touch the real everyday life of old age and hold it within my hands. I want to write a poem of a new class, in a measure a Don Juan, without the mockery and impurity and admitting of as much as philosophical dreaming and digression, which is in fact a characteristic of the age, as I like to use. Being characteristic of the age is a form of social responsibility. Reading is no longer a hobby only of the elite. Literacy is slowly increasing as primary level of education, offered gradually turning into first a church and then a state concern. In April of this year, as a private prayer meeting on Gray's Island Road, four ordinary Londoners create a ragged school union which, chaired by the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, will found more than 200 schools for destitute children over the next 8 years, including some that Arabella will dedicate herself to. And so, although that Richard Hogarth, a century from now, will call the massification of the pulp tabloid reading matters that shapes worldly working class culture is still in the future, fiction and poetry are beginning to find mass audiences. Charles Dickens, for example, through 6 years older than Elizabeth, is already enjoying huge popular success and royal approval. While writing his emerging readership doesn't mean dubbing down, but it works best when mainstream values are generally shared. Elizabeth and her poetic peers are thoroughgoing Victorians, in turning their back on the romantic visions of poetics and prophetic expressions, Shelley's unacknowledged legislatures of the world. Instead, they view poetry as speaking to the special, quasi-spiritual part of every individual, reaching past nature into God. As Elizabeth puts it in the Anthemium, poetry is still exceptional, and it plays its special part within each life and democratizing, flattening effect, as this has more than a little in common with the congregational, nonconformist Christianity that the Barretts by now thoroughly espouse. As a result, Elizabeth and her poets, like her, as explicitly trying to give their every man and every woman reader a taste of beauty. There are some striking parallels with how at the other end of the religious revival, Victorian high Anglicanism is highly liturgical, smells and bells, and extravagantly ornamented in builds of Gothic revivalist prodigy Augustus Pugin to draw on worshippers. In both verse and prose, this is the era of the adjective. Poetry flirts and with glamorously evocative settings, some orientalizing, others historical. Elizabeth draws all these vibrating strings simultaneously tight in poems like The Lay of the Brown Rosary, wherein a perfect storm of symbolism and purple prosody, the haunted bride Honora fatally embraces her groom in a ruined chapel somewhere that's both foreign and Roman Catholic, ethics having got muddled up with the old Barrett anti-Catholicism. The gray owl is on the ruin wall, shut both his eyes to hide thee, and ever he flapped his heavy wings all broken and weak, and the long grass waved against the sky around his gasping beak. I sate beside thee all the night, while the moonlight lay forlorn, strewn round us like a dead world shroud and ghastly fragments torn. Everywhere the new poetry preaches an explicitly social morality, licensing such fantasies by trying up senses of sensual bliss and moral closure, until its austere conclusion that knowledge by suffering endureth, and life is perfectly perfected by death. Elizabeth's own A Vision of Poets is visibly sensual, and its pictorial and archetypal living poet, sometimes through the moralist slant and the raw economic progress, is slowly recognized as a source of social ills, romantic nostalgic, whether in Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott or in Elizabeth's The Romanot of the Page, offers a comforting counter fantasy, precisely through its quaint medievalism and far-flung settings, such as poetry turns toward the changing society it serves, as even Elizabeth, writing among her plaster busts of the dead greats, is aware, and after all, she is herself a daughter of the new mercantile class, and while there's nothing like London life for keeping you in the literary swim, there is also nothing like London for reminding you of the wider society on your doorstep. Wimpole Street is smart, but it's no gated community. On September 13th, 1842, Crow arrives home in floods of tears from walking flush. Trotting loose behind her is busy Mortimer Street. A few blocks from home, the little dog has been pounced on and stolen. All the maid knows is that she heard his stranger alarm bark, and when she turned round, he had vanished. Elizabeth is distraught, and while she sobs herself into a favor, the three boys still at home, Seddy, Alfred, and Henry, get on the case. They, having missing notices printed up within hours, and post them all up around the neighborhood the same day. And there's no news, and Elizabeth passes a sleepless night. I will think we will leave this lesson about the stolen dog of Flush. What happens to Flush? We will find out tomorrow. We'll leave it for another lesson of what happens to Flush and how to be dutiful. Think there's any truth in here in what I'm saying to the modern day world, and how, for any woman who's out there listening to me right now or ever in the future, your rights came from this, what these ladies are doing 300 years ago. So I hope you appreciate what's going on here. Like and subscribe, and have a nice day.